what else? I want to ask you one other informal thing before we get it. I have a lot of questions for you, and I really, really enjoyed this book and the video series.
Oh,
So you've given me a lot to think about, and I have a bunch of questions. I'm just curious. This is totally irrelevant, but are people up there happy or unhappy about the resignation yesterday?
oh, overwhelmingly happy. Overwhelmingly happy across the country. It's been a long time since I've seen this kind of consensus, political consensus. Yeah, it's the general view that he has become, uh, uh, he and his government, he specifically and the government in general have become very corrupt, and that they need to go. They need to go. Corrupt um, and many main problems are not being handled well. That's sort of the general consensus.
Okay, that's what I thought. That's the vibe I'm getting, and also I think maybe it's a good segue into start talking about some of the concepts that you lay out. You've identified essentially that there is a crisis of meaning
Yes.
in the world, and that there's multiple factors, multiple negative factors as to why that is. You talk about media, low trust in institutions, like you
Yep.
just mentioned, loneliness, and a bunch of other factors. But my question is, and you also provide some of the searching that's going on for solutions to this problem, which I think that's the critical part. But was there some kind of catalyzing event for you? Was there something that happened that got you motivated to start exploring this?
Well, I mean, I grew up in a fundamentalist Christianity, and then as I left that, uh, um, and only later realized how traumatizing it had been, I had to go through therapy. Um, um, I nevertheless had I sometimes say I had the taste for the transcendence left in my mouth by that sort of mother religion,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and I went. So I fell into my own personal meaning crisis, and I was in my late teens, early 20s, appropriate time to do so, and I wrestled with that a lot. I met the figure of Socrates in the first year of university, and that gave me my first role model of how is it that one could cultivate spirituality and wisdom in a way that didn't seem to require what I had found as a traumatizing structure within the Christianity I had been presented. But unfortunately, that philosophical take that's presented by Plato and Socrates, where philosophy is about the cultivation of wisdom and the seeking of the good life in philia, in fellowship, that drops out of academic philosophy after you're introduced to it as the ideal, which was disheartening. I went on to get my degrees in philosophy because I found the skills they were giving me, meta scientific skills and metacultural skills and meta ethical skills, terrifically valuable. But the project of cultivating wisdom was not being addressed. So I took up right down, literally down the road. I took up Tai Chi Chuan and meta contemplation and Vipassana meditation, and which I would now call an ecology of practices. And I started to go through these transformations, very often very profound, and other people were noticing it in me.
Hmm.
And about that same time, I heard about a new discipline called cognitive science. So I went back and got an honors BSc in cognitive science to get training as a scientist. And I started to put these two together. And somebody who had a huge influence on me, a friend and colleague of mine, Evan Thompson, introduced me to a way of doing cognitive science that started to bring together these, uh, these wisdom cultivating practices and the scientific study of the mind. Um, and so I started to draw them together. And he was supposed to teach a course called Buddhism and Cognitive Science, and he couldn't do it. And they said, "Well, is there anybody else that could do this?" And he said, "Well, John can do it." So I started teaching that. And when I started doing this convergence that I had found personally relevant and talking about, I was the first person to academically teach about mindfulness, to teach about the psychology and cognitive science of wisdom, and then bring up the meaning crisis. My students' eyes would just go like this, and I realized, oh, there's something else going on here. So I've always been an amateur historian. I won like a couple of history awards when I was in high school and things like that. So I was always interested in, so I did a deep dive into, right, the history and brought that together with the cognitive science and what was happening in that course. And then I had a student approach me, and he'd taken that course, Buddhism and cognitive science, and he'd taken a course on the psychology of wisdom that I taught. And he said, "You got to put this on YouTube." And so he said, "I'm a professional videographer. My father's a professional editor. His name is Alan Keon. I owe everything to Alan in some senses." Um, and uh, and then along the way, I had started to write a book that never got published with Christopher Mastropietro called Science and the Sage, but that got broken up into multiple other books. And then all of this came together, did the video series, and then Chris and I started working together, and that's how it happened.
When when your students were looking at you bright-eyed as you were describing, what do you think that they're realizing? What were you identifying in them that needed addressing?
So, see, the meaning crisis it's more complex than it's often understood. If you ask most people the sort of basic scientific questionnaire about meaning in life, like, do you have friends? Do you have family? Do you have work projects? Yeah, they're sort of above average on meaning. They're not like and so you have to be really careful. You have to think about, right, we can talk a little bit more about what specifically the meaning crisis is. Let's just take it intuitively. You've got sort of four kinds of response. Some people suffer, like they suffer a reaction to the loss, and that these are the people of loneliness, right? These are the people of addiction. Uh, uh, these are people of mental health struggle. And then there's a group of people that are that get picked up by these these scientific measures, right? Although when you do larger surveys, you get a lot more reports of, especially of young people finding their lives meaningless. Like there was one done in the UK that showed that. But for a lot of people, what they're doing is they're sort of living in this little tiny bubble. And I'm going to be a little bit pejorative here because that's part of the problem, right? In which they're sort of caught in a cycle of, you know, um, they're very busy. Um, they burn out, they get bored, and they go into busyness, and they're cycling around in that. And what that means is, in a lot of ways, they're suffering, but they have positive answers to the standard questions. But what's showing up for them is they have right they have a very small scope of meaning. It's quite fragile. So if they get hit by some major things, they don't have significant resilience, and COVID showed that
Mm-hmm.
uh, quite significantly. So when that routine of busyness unto death gets disrupted, a lot of people are sort of exposed uh, to existential forms of burnout and the consequences of burnout, and also of kind of existential boredom, not just a bit of a daily boredom. It's like, oh, right, and that
Right.
then you have groups of people that do sort of reactive replacement. These are people who are seeking to replace the things that used to give our culture meaning: philosophy, religion, poetry, uh, prophecy, not in the current term of foretelling the future, but people like Martin Luther King who would explicate a powerful, or Gandhi, explicate something that's implicit that needs to be brought into awareness. Um, and that, and so people look for, you know, they look for those kinds of worlds in, maybe it's a video game, and we have video game addiction, or maybe it's the MC universe and people's religious attitudes towards the MC universe. When it gets trespassed on, they don't act the way they act like we used to act about sitcoms. They go into a rage, and because their sacredness is being assailed. And then finally you have people who are doing, responsible replacement. They're not reactive. What they're doing is, and so you see positive symptoms like the mindfulness revolution, the return of stoicism, more and more of these kinds of podcasts, more and more communities where people are getting together and either recovering old rituals or coming up with new rituals to try and cultivate meaning and wisdom. So that's comprehensively what's going on. And so my students would be a mixture of those, to answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them there would be the hunger because they're lonely or they're on the edge of despair. Some of them are battling with various kinds of ways in which their agency is being lost to them. They're being manipulated by advertising and social media, stuff like it. Some of them are because they're students. As soon as you sort of burst that bubble of busyness and burnout and boredom, they feel and then there's many people that have started up that practice, or at least they get a sense that they would like to have a more and a deeper kind of meaning in their life. They'd like to cultivate wisdom. So I'll give you one more thing, Adam, and then I'll be quiet. So I'll ask my students, where do you go for information? And like the cyborgs that we're all becoming, they hold up their phones. Where do you go for knowledge? And they're a little bit jaundiced, postmodern, right stuff, and well, the university, science, but they're worried about those institutions failing. And then I say, where do you go for wisdom?
Mm-hmm.
And there's an anxious silence.
Hmm.
And so those are all the ways in which the eyes get opened.
So what you're saying for me generates like a bunch of questions about wisdom, and I sort of want to unpack that on one level, but I also, but meaning is also critical, and the two are related. So let me frame a question about meaning to you like this. There's a show that my 14-year-old son is really into called The Amazing Digital Circus. And it's about these crazy looking cartoon figures in this sort of very circus-like but disturbing sort of world. None of them know why they're there. And one of them has a vague memory of like putting on a VR set at some point in the distant past. And they go through a set of activities that this AI named Kane sets up. And the stated purpose of these activities is basically to keep them sane. Meaning, if they didn't have something to do in this place, they would go nuts. And this somehow the whole thing just struck me, and they're all struggling with their emotions and they're struggling to make sense of what they're doing and why they're doing it. So when we talk about meaning, can meaning exist in a vacuum outside of like a big M meaning, like an objective meaning, like this is meaning, or is anything a substitute, so to speak, for meaning? Is my stamp collection sufficient to be meaningful in my life, or is there some other level that we're meant to aspire to?
Okay, so this is another critique I have of the standard psychological construct. This is a self-critique, by the way, because I used to just use, without reflection, the standard psychological construct. But I'm engaged in a project right now, very much like I did with the mindfulness construct, of a very powerful critique and reformulation. But the point you bring out is that meaning is what's called a thick term. Thin terms are terms that just sort of like, bottle. Okay, great, right? You're just pointing at something. But let's take a term rational. That's a non-controversial thick. It not only describes, it praises.
Mm-hmm.
So it's got in the philosophical sense, not the statistical sense, but in the philosophical sense, it has a normative dimension. It demands of people that they try to orient to what is more true, what is more good, what is more beautiful, that sort of thing, right? Meaning is also a thick term. When we say somebody's life is meaningful, we're not merely describing it, we're praising it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so the problem we have is the psychological sense. It doesn't pick up on the normative dimension, which is part of what it is to properly have meaning, is to aspire to have more and to have better meaning, because it is properly a normative thing.
Okay.
Okay. So you can satisfy the psychological need, let's put it that way, of that kind of connectedness that's going on with your son in that virtual world. Because what is the virtual world supplying? Right? It's picking up enough on these. So another problem with the standard construct, it's all self-centered. Is your life meaningful to you? And we don't have questions about, is the world meaningful? Does the world make sense? Is it a proper home for you? So notice that what's happening is there's an acknowledgement that the world isn't meaningful. That's why the world is kind of creepy and alien, and they're properly not at home in it. But you can try and cultivate some basic sanity, which is a basic kind of connectedness. And what it's doing is it's giving you a story you can
Mm-hmm.
belong to, giving you a set of rules you can discover, so the world becomes makes sense to you, and it gives you a way of leveling up or getting better, or at least maintaining something,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you can get the sort of core psychological dimensions on the self end of meaning in that situation. But notice what that's associated with. It's associated with this sort of red queen dilemma of running to stay in place. You're having to put all this effort just to stay sane, not to become like, right. So you have that default low level of meaning that is preserves your cognitive agency, preserves your sanity, right? I mean, I think that has to do with basic mechanisms. Maybe we'll talk about, maybe we won't, about relevance realization. But you don't have those
I
moments
wrote
of
it down.
okay, what Rosa calls resonance, where it's not you're zeroing in on things that you consider important, but not how are they important to you. It's more that this is something important that deserves your attention and your time. You come around, right, the bend, um, and you see the sunset, and it calls to you, and something emerges on you unpredictably because of the unpredictability of that, and you feel that you're getting in touch with something that's deeper and better, right? That's resonance.
Mm-hmm.
And what's probably lacking in your son's game for the characters are moments of resonance, because resonance requires not only that the self is finding meaning, but the world can home you, the world can call to you, it can provide you a way. And why do we need to be called? Because there's a normative dimension to meaning. You need something to call you beyond where you've gotten stuck in your meaning project, because meaning is inherently normative.
So my inclination is to wholly agree with what you just said. Um,
Okay.
um, let me put on my like skeptic hat for a second.
Please.
Okay, let's say I'm a physicist, and I look at a sunset and I say that's a really very pretty sunset. However, I know that all it really is a gigantic ball of hydrogen that is sinking below, or seemingly sinking below the surface of the horizon. It has no actual meaning. It is as Richard Dawkins said, it's a blind, pitiless indifference in the universe. And just because it makes some nice colors doesn't really mean anything.
Sure. So that's an important skeptical response, which means I can't give you a sort of like one shot. This requires a bit of argumentative development, is what I'll need. But the problem with that is, okay, then that this is the other issue. This is the issue that is lurking behind the people who are just caught up in busyness,
Right.
right? This might all just be an illusion. So there's a lurking performative contradiction, not a contradiction between proposition, performative contradictions. Like, for example, here's I'm fast asleep right now, right? I have to be conscious to speak. And
Right.
so the state that is presupposed by my statement, those two could be in contradiction. Now, notice that there's something interesting going on with the scientist. The scientist is claiming that the level at which things are meaningful and which he's oriented towards trying to find beautiful patterns and questioning whether or not they're true, that is actually an illusory orientation, because that's what we're talking about with meaning. Yet science presupposes that.
Mm-hmm.
If I should be a scientist, I have to find some facts more important than others. I have to find the facts that are beautiful, elegant, the ones that take me into reality rather than distracting me from reality. And I have to find the quest to do that fundamentally intrinsically good, because the truth is intrinsically good. So the scientist, like Dawkins, is making a kind of performative contradiction. He says this whole way of talking, that's an illusion. Yeah, but the state from which I make those statements is the state from which you're doing science. And so what now happens? Am I supposed to regard the conclusions of science that are filtered through meaning also illusory? And then how would you possibly know that the sunset is just a ball of hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera?
I think you would say because we could test it and we know, that's the only information that is presented to us. And I think he would say
And
that,
why did you test that, Richard, as opposed to finding out if there's a correlation between the number of paper clips in your office and the number of squirrels you will see in the day? Why did you pick that one? And why do you seek for a broad and powerful explanation and not be satisfied with a limited local explanation? And Richard, why do you think that all your theories should be unified together, and why not just disparate and separate? See?
yeah, I do. And obviously, I would be delighted if thinkers thought more along those lines, and I think we would all be better off in the long run, frankly. But no, your point is well taken, and I think it's a good answer to the question. I do wonder sometimes if there is some way of helping people by doing some type of measurement, by doing science, in a way that demonstrates that there is a correlation between these things, that there is this sort of meta meaning available in life. And I suspect, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that you might say something like, look, you got to sit down and do it and then see how it hits you. You got to try meditation. You've got to understand what mindfulness is, or so on and so forth. It's something you have to experience as opposed to put down on paper. Am I right?
Well, I would say both. I would say there is a science that does that. You're not going to, the science is not physics. The science is cognitive science. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where all the work about relevance realization and other things is taking place. And that cognitive science, as I've argued, points to the fact that we have multiple kinds of knowing. We have the propositional kind of knowing that is the hallmark of the scientific statement, knowing that the sun is a hydrogen giant, for example, knowing that. And what we do is we gather evidence and we have beliefs that convince us that they're true, and we store those in a specific kind of memory called semantic memory. That's very different from knowing how to catch a ball or knowing how to swim. That's procedural knowledge, and that's your skill knowledge. It doesn't give you a sense of conviction. Are your skills true or false? That doesn't make any sense. It's how powerful they are. Do they apply, and do they apply well, right? And then that's stored in a different kind of memory. There's a reason why we have these different kinds of memory. That's procedural memory,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you have, well, how do you know what skill to be using right now? And even the scientist has to make use of skills before they can come to their propositional conclusions. Well, I have to have a state of consciousness. I have to have a state of mind that in which I'm foregrounding some things, backgrounding others. So, right, things are standing out to me. I'm taking a perspective. I know what it's like to be me here in this place, here and now. I have a sense of presence. Notice that, for example, when my beloved partner is gone, I believe she's still alive. I believe she's still in relationship to me. All my skills of interacting with her are still there, but I miss her presence.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that, by the way, that's why that's what we're trying to get in video games. We're trying to get a sense of what's it, I'm really in the game. I really have this, right? I know what it's like to be here now in the game. That's perspectival knowing. And you have a kind of memory associated with that. It's called episodic memory. It's the kind of memory that you engage when I say, do you remember what you ate for breakfast? And you'll relive an event. That's very different from engaging a skill or remembering a fact like cats or mammals. You relive an event. You have episodic memory. And then it's like, what makes that fittedness of cognition and consciousness to the world possible? Well, your biology and your ecology, right? And that's modified by culture and technology, but they have to be co-shaping each other. Right? This is called niche construction. I'm shaping the environment's shaping me. We're participating in the same patterns, the same principles, the same processes. That gives me participatory knowing. And that one's largely unconscious, but you know what it's missing when your son gets a sense that the world doesn't quite feel right. Things are out of joint. There's that sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
The at homeness is gone. And you have a particular kind of memory for that. That's called your identity, your sense of self. And you can do the cognitive science, which is propositions, about the non-propositional. but the propositions can't be the non-proposition. So you have to be very careful when I answer your question. Yes, there's a science. We can measure relevance realization. We can do all kinds of scientific work. I publish on this stuff, and that's the science. But that it won't give you what we're talking about. That will epistemologically justify and explain it. But to actually have it, to realize it, you have to engage the non-propositional kinds of knowing.
Yes, I hear that, and I hope that this kind of information gets out and gains more credibility, and concurrently that people can be taught in a way that is credible to them
Yes.
how to experience these things, and for them not to be considered absurd, and thereby address some of the meaning crisis, because of course if there's no meaning, there's no meaning, and if you can't taste it, if you can't experience it on any level, of course you're going to conclude that the world is meaningless, and then all the problems that emerge from that will be there.
And I just said,
Yeah.
never met, because we've set up a whole, and it's financially independent from me. It's autonomous, although I helped to give birth to it with Taylor Barrett and Christopher Master Pietro and Ethan Say and other people. Called Awaken to Meaning, a platform where you can go and do mindfulness practices and dialogical practices and imaginal practice, all the kinds of things. But it's been I don't have scientific evidence for this, but we've done lots of workshops, lots of courses. And it's never been the case that when people are able to cultivate more and better credible meaning, they go, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. That's never the case.
Right.
They always go, oh, they always express. They say things like, I've always wanted this, although I didn't realize that I did. And that is the best marker of how the meaning crisis actually shows up in us. I always wanted this, although I didn't realize that I did.
Which describes the human condition, I think, for almost all of us to some extent, some more than others, but I think it's true that we're all feeling somewhat not at ease in the world.
Yes.
And looking for something more grounding and more inspired and bigger than whatever we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis.
And more real. And more real.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The lack of reality is very disturbing, culturally and otherwise, when like you say in the book, like if you're lied to enough times, you don't know what ground you stand on, and it's hard to draw conclusions about anything, really.
Well, and that's the other, and in complement that, there's another B to go with the burnout and the busyness and the boredom, which is, and I'm using this in a technical sense, I'm not trying to be offensive. This is Frankfurt's notion of bullshit. See, the liar is still working in terms of the value of truth. They're depending on you valuing truth in order to manipulate you.
Right.
The bullshit artist is trying to get you unconcerned with whether or not something is true or therefore real, and instead just caught up in the emotional or attentional salience. And our world has devolved into 24/7 advertising, and advertising is automated, professionally delivered bullshit. I mean, that's what it's designed to do. And so we're in a very rough place. And our politics has devolved into advertising as opposed to argument. And so that's another thing, that pervasive sense of bullshit. So when we wrote the book when Chris and Philip Mincevic and I wrote the book on zombies, which was a precursor, how zombies are like a metaphor for a modern myth for the meaning crisis. We did a thing about the use on the internet of the term bullshit, and it's just skyrocketing. It's just skyrocketing. People are just like everywhere. People get this amazing sense. Now, the thing is, again, if you go and ask them the standard question, do you have friends? Do you have a purpose? Do you have family? Oh, yes, yes. You see, that's what I mean. That's what's missing. That's the meat of the matter.
So let's talk about that. The superheroes and zombies, which you emphasize a lot, which and I think it's a really interesting observation. Culturally, at least in the States, we seem to be obsessed with superheroes, and it's another thing I've asked my younger kids. Is like all these movies in the Marvel universe to me seem like so canned, so predictable, so like uninteresting, you know, but they revel in them. They like it's they know all the characters and all the timelines and like um so that's like what is the obsession with the superhero about on the one hand, and the opposite, which is the zombie, right, which is like this fully evil, thoughtless, you know, creature who marauds and destroys the whole world, you know.
Yep.
Okay, so let me ask that question in the context of why is it so black and white? Like why do we have like these supreme good beings and these supreme bad? Like there's no nuance, there's no
Yep.
humanity
So
to it.
because I think what's going on is we're talking about something that's happening at a very pervasive and profound level, and the level that the sort of cognitive cultural level we draw upon when we address that kind of thing is are mythological. See, your kids love the MC universe because they love the universe. They actually love the world.
Mm-hmm.
There's a world in which some human beings have gone through significant self-transcendence. There's a world in which there are powerful narratives that really make a huge difference, right? There's a world in which there are real moral rules and epistemological rules. You can know what's really going on. You can figure it out, and you can know what the right thing to do. That world is deeply attractive. They love it because they want to spend time in it, which is why they don't like it when that world is being sacrificed for political ideology. Because a world beset by political ideology is the world they are trying to leave behind, where it's nothing but adversarial propositional warfare. And they want to go back to a world where their mythological concerns, they wouldn't put it this way, I'm putting it this way, but where their mythological concerns are being addressed. So that's why so white and then zombie so black, because that's when they turn to touch that. And this is why the relationship to it is so non-propositional. They're not there to gather facts about zombies. People will even do zombie walks, which we wrote about in the book, which is so weird. Like thousands of people dress up in zombies and take like they want to they want to confront this. They want to confront this meaninglessness that's, just like a penumbra at the very periphery of their awareness. And they want to try and foreground it. In some way, they want to try to share and articulate it to each other. And so nuance is not important when you're in that kind of stringent situation.
Okay, do you think it benefits them?
No, I think I think I think the zombies and the superheroes, Christopher Massapietro and I, we argue that they're prime examples of reactive displacement. They're
Okay.
the attempts to give us the gods and the demons that religion used to give us. They're attempts to give us, us great stories, great abilities of self-transcendence, magical power. Like they're religion surrogates because religion was the thing that used to give us this, right? And they introduce us to heroes and godlike beings, like or the other. See, the thing about the zombies is the zombie is actually a powerful morality tale that people don't realize. See, the zombie is not supernatural. The zombie is us,
Mm-hmm.
decayed, literally decayed, in which we no longer have community. We are in a horde. We no longer have meaning. We no longer have direction. We drift and we consume without satisfaction or purpose, right? And so it's a morality tale, and it's a perversion of the Christian idea of the resurrection. You come back from the dead, but not to a glorious life, but to a decadent life. And then it's like magnetism. They got attracted to the Christian notion of the apocalypse, where the apocalypse was supposed to be the final redemption of the world. But instead, in the zombie apocalypse, it's the final condemnation of the world to endless meaninglessness. You see, so these things, they express the crisis, but they don't really address it. They
Mm-hmm.
don't give people a scientific understanding that would make credible sets of practices. I like to call it an ecology of practices that will actually help them cultivate more and better meaning in life, which is deeply interpenetrated with the cultivation of wisdom.
Okay, that was very interesting, um, and added on a lot to what I already enjoyed you expressing in your book and your videos. And that gives me a lot that reframes the whole zombie thing in a, I think, a really important way. And I think it seems intuitive that what you're saying is correct. Um,
Thank you.
so let's talk about the way out of it, which is what you call relevance realization. And
Mm,
I wrote down a quote. It's either from the book or from a video. I can't remember. But you say enlightenment involves a radical improvement in relevance realization, a heightened ability to discern what truly matters, cut through distractions, and align oneself with the flow of reality. And you
yes,
talk about flow in the book. Um,
yes.
okay, so how does one start? Let's say I want to be enlightened. People listening to this are convinced we've got a problem. Yes, I'm feeling these feelings that you guys are describing. What should I do? What how do I gain enlightenment?
So this is a really simultaneously important and challenging question. So a part of this, a big marker of again the meaning crisis is the rise of the spiritual but not religious.
Mm-hmm.
In recognition that self-transformation, self-transcendence needs to occur. The problem with the spiritual but not religious is it's still immersed in, um, and it's justifiable. I give historical arguments, and there's all additional one, but a growing distrust and sense of disenfranchisement from all of our institutions, right? So people, not what they're basically saying is, I want to do what religion does, but I don't want to belong to institutional religion. That's basically, in a nutshell, how you pick out, because it doesn't mean anything else, right? It doesn't mean anything else clearly, or at least when you take a look at anthropological and sociological work on it, right? In fact, I've read many people, many academics, theorists on this that say spiritual but not religious just means the spirituality of me. The religion of me.
Mm-hmm.
Spiritual but not religious is the religion of me. And first of all, I want to be clear that I understand. I have proper sympathy, both that mixture of understanding and empathy, right, for why people distrust institutions. There's good reasons, and some of them are articulated in the book, right? However, there's a problem if you just do spiritual but not religious. I am answering your question, by the way, because the problem is you're doing it in a way that is exacerbating a lot of the factors that are driving the meaning crisis. You're buying into, a kind of rugged individualism, and that you can be self-made, you can be an autodidact, right? And you can somehow get really good at cutting through your own bullshit. And all of those are largely false. Your cognition isn't inherently individualistic. This is something I can argue at length if we need to. Your cognition, being autodidactic, very, very dangerous. You get into all kinds of bias reinforcement. And the problem with social media is it makes it seem like you're getting independent corroboration, but you're not, because you pick the people who agree with you. You get echo chambering, right? And then, right, the idea that you're really good at cutting through your own bullshit is actually false. You're really good at cutting through other people's bullshit. We're really bad at cutting through our own.
Mm-hmm.
We fundamentally need each other in these deeply shared practices. That's what ritual is. These shared practices in which I become your best opportunity for self-transcendence and you become my best one. There's things we have to do on our own so that we can properly come in. So you need to have an ecology of practices. Some of them have to be individual, some of them have to be group. They have to be ecologies because they have to address different things. You have to train your attention with mindfulness. You have to train your imagination with imaginal practices. You have to train. I don't even use the English word dialogue. I use the Greek word because the English word is so denuded. Dialogos. We have to get back from the model we have now is I'm transmitting information to you and I'm trying to like
Mm-hmm.
defeat you and you will take up my position. It's an adversarial transmission. And I win if I debunk you or defeat you or get you to join my cause, right? And that is absolutely destructive because that puts you into game theoretic, and then everybody does tit for tat, and you spiral down to the lowest common denominator.
Yes.
Think of the opposite. We've all had this. You get caught up in a conversation that takes on a life of its own. It starts going places you and the other people did not expect. And you feel so alive and you feel so in touch with both your inner reality and the outer reality. You feel so connected to these people. That's dialogos. That's a kind of flow. So
Mm-hmm.
you need dialogical practices. You need an ecology of practices, individual and group, different domains of practice. You need embodiment. You have to use the body has to be involved, right? You have to use imaginal practices, dialogical practices, mindfulness practices, reflective practices, and then you need them housed within a credible, and I mean scientifically credible framework that will protect you against somebody coming in trying to say, but it's all just an illusion. That's what we need. And that's the project I've been working on. However, I have an important criticism of everything I said to you.
Okay.
I think it's right, but it can be fundamentally wrong. And I was wrong about it in an important way. This can strike you as an engineering project that we somehow have to sort of build this. I used to call it the religion that's not a religion. We'll make an ecology, we'll do all of this, we'll just make it and offer it to the world. And it's like, nope. that, those conversations that are so living are living because they take on a life of their own. If I try to engineer them, I will crush them.
Mm-hmm.
It's like explaining a joke,
Right.
right? What I can do, so we make a distinction. I can do dialectic. I can do a whole bunch of practices that increase the chances that that spark will catch. But if I try and engineer and demand produce that spark, I'm losing the sacredness, its ability to launch me into self-transcending, transformative meaning, right? Is removed. So there's another project that is needed in addition to sort of tutoring people on an ecology of practices that makes them prone to moments of resonance and reverence. We need a that's what I'm doing in my next big series. We need a way of creating a lingua philosophica between all of the big wisdom traditions, you know, European, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Indian, Japanese, Chinese, so that we can engage in a comprehensive um, ecology of traditions. Uh, because I think what is cusping right now, and I've been privileged to see this, is what I'm calling the advent of the sacred.
Mm-hmm.
One of the responses, one of the responses to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times of nihilism, right,
Mm-hmm.
and cynicism and despair, is the Weltgeist, the spirit of the world, to use a Hegel term, of the advent of the sacred, right? Like something like happened in the Axial Revolution or the Renaissance, where like there's this thing that starts happening as a response to the breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's happening. And so we need to properly. I'm going to go on a pilgrimage and go to these places and talk to talk to the sages of these places, of these great traditions that were so integrative and deeply able to talk to each other, and try and afford the advent of the sacred while trying to also further develop, scientifically credible ecologies of practices that people can either take up or take back into, because a lot of people do that, into a renewal, a rehoming within one of the organized religions. Many people take up my work that way, and that's great. We need to do both of those, and I'm trying to do both.
That that sounds great, and and I hope you will be very successful with that. And will benefit a lot of people. Um, I, as always happens, I could have like another hour or two conversation along these lines. It's literally my favorite thing to talk about. And however, um, my time is coming to an end, but I want to see if I can get in one more question.
Sure.
Okay. You talk about the initiation ritual, and I've often wondered whether that would be of benefit nowadays. And I'm not talking about like staying on the fire ant, hill, all night long and like an enduring immense pain. But do we have any examples of that in our culture, where something has to be endured to sort of open your mind and demonstrate your own capacity to yourself and so on and so forth? And if we don't have it, do you think that would be a useful doorway to get towards a more enlightened self?
I do. I think the fact that we have made what's left of our initiation rituals non-costly has cost us tremendously. So, um,
You want them to be costly.
yeah, because that there has to be a willingness to give up, to let your identity and your frames, the way you're framing the world, let you. I'll be a little bit poetic. Let the world and you simultaneously, reciprocally crack open.
Mm-hmm.
And that cracking open takes some smashing usually. Now, of course, what you need, and this is also another function of these, the people that administer these initiations are people that have gone through it, and therefore we find them credible. And one of the problems, and you see this especially in the younger generations, they don't have credible role models. And the thing that's most predictive, by the way, of people successfully aspiring, like of transforming and becoming better, becoming more the person they would aspire to be, is not planning or budgeting or blah, 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 blah. The two things are joining a group that with people you find credible, because of the next point. You need to find credible people that you will internalize as role models, because
Mm-hmm.
most of this is happening non-propositionally. Just gathering facts won't do it. You need to have the presence of people that are credible, that challenge you, and that you trust to go through things that you can't properly foresee, because you can't foresee how a transformation is going to change you. Because if you could foresee it, you could merely engineer it into place. So we do need these initiation experiences. There are some that are very powerful. My friend Rafe Kelly has a return to the source. Um, Wonderful ecology practices. A dear friend of mine. And I did this, and I'm here I am. I'm like 60, 60 or 61, and I'm going through this course with all these 20 somethings. Um, uh, you're doing parkour in the wild and climbing, I mean, like serious climbing and martial arts. And I knew I was going to get hurt, and I knew every day there would be something that I wouldn't want to do because I was very afraid to do it. And I made a promise to myself that I would take the injury, and that do I would do it. There was one or two things I couldn't do because I have Meniere's, and if that got
Hmm.
triggered, then I would wash out. And Rafe and I talked about that, and that was. But other than that, I was committed to doing everything at least once, right? At least once, and so that's there for people who really want to do that kind of initiation into an orientation towards wisdom. There's return to the source. I can't remember Ben's last name right now. It slipped me. He does vision quests, and they're
Mm-hmm.
supervised. You're safe, but of course you take it out into the wilderness, and he's lurking, but out of view, making sure that you're safe. But you go through a vision quest,
Hmm.
right? You have to stay in the circle. You're deprived of everything but water. You have to vision quest. There's people offering, and people that are credible doing that kind of things. Something that people mistake for initiation ceremony, which is very much more questionable, is like ayahuasca tourism.
Right.
Travel down. The psychedelic renaissance is part of the advent of the sacred, but a lot of people are not educating on the science and the philosophy of psychedelic experience in order to properly set their mind, right, the right setting, have the right credible people, have a good integration framework, have a lot of skills for dealing with the possibilities of self-deception. You have to have all of that before these experiences, or you're putting yourself at tremendous risk. Um, so
That was the whole conversation really great. And I think you have a particularly articulate presentation, which I really appreciate. So I want to thank you for taking the time to be here today. I want to recommend that people go out and buy all your books and watch your videos on YouTube and wherever else they may be, and really sit and think about what you're saying, because I think it's something that we all need to explore, in a deeper way and benefit from. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. This was fantastic, and thank you for promoting the book. And if I could ask, if people like the book, well, do what you want, but obviously, if you like the book, please think about writing a review on Amazon. That also helps.
I will do that myself.
Thank you, Adam.
Okay. Thank you for being here.
Anytime you want me to come back, I'm happy to come back. This was fantastic.
Okay. We'll have you back, and have a great day, and enjoy the new Canadian world.